Welcome everyone to this BFI at Home event as part of Cruel Flesh, the films of the new French Extremity. This season going on at BFI Southbank throughout the whole of the month of May, exploring some of the brutally intimate and sometimes just purely brutal films associated with this moment in French cinema. I'm Anna Bogutskaya. I'm a writer and broadcaster and also the season programmer of Cruel Flesh. Now, the new French Extremity is often thought to be just horror films, which isn't really true, but horror does make up such a strong component of this moment in film. And to explore that, we put together this panel of experts on horror cinema and the new French Extremity in particular. So joining me to discuss the horror side of the new French Extremity are Alexandra West, author of the book Films of the New French Extremity, Visceral Horror and National Identity, and co-host of the very excellent Faculty of Horror podcast, and Lindsay Hallam, senior lecturer in film at the University of East London, who researches horror, gender, and the body. Now, with apologies from Alexandra Helen Nicholas, who was due to join us, but unfortunately is feeling poorly at the time of this recording, so she won't be able to join us for this conversation and her voice will definitely be missed. But Alex and Lindsay, I'm very excited to be talking about this moment in horror cinema with you both tonight. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for asking us.
Super excité to be here. Bonjour tout le monde. That's about all of my Canadian franglais that I can muster right now.
I should probably have a disclaimer. My French pronunciation is so terrible that I will probably butcher a lot of names during this conversation.
You know what? There will be no French shaming during the recording of this panel. I'm sure we could all do better, and I'm deeply ashamed that I was once fluent in French and considerably less so now. But to start us off, I wanted to ask you both really, what was your own entry point into the films of the new French Extremity? What was the first film that you remember watching? And Lindsay, you're on my screen now, so let's start with you.
I'm trying to think of what the first one was, because I think that this was all happening around the time that I was at university, and then I ended up doing my PhD on the philosophy of the Marquis de Sade. So a lot of what the new French Extremity was all about was kind of very much playing into what I was researching at the time. So I'm trying to think of what my first film was. Possibly Trouble Every Day, because that ended up being in my PhD. And I wasn't really that aware of Claire Denis' other films. So it was the first Claire Denis film that I saw as well. And yeah, it's kind of interesting that I'm sure Alex can understand that you find these films and then you find yourself watching them and taking notes, and it's a strange feeling. But yeah, so I think it was very much to do with the research that I was doing on my PhD. Is where I started to find them all. Also, I worked at video libraries, and I remember finding I Stand Alone. I remember that was an interesting viewing experience, and yeah, and also seeing Irreversible at the cinema. I think that's the one screening where I have never seen so many people walked out. I started counting, and I got beyond 20.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
I mean, that's certainly a lot of different entry points into this subgenre. Alex, what about you?
So mine I have a pretty vivid memory of. It was High Tension, and I rented it with a friend of mine shortly after it was released. So I want to say like 2005, 2006. And it was like a bright sunny day, and we just sat down, we watched it in her living room, and we were both like, oh, this is an odd movie. Like, it was so successful at so many things, but then when we got to the end, which I won't not reveal, when we got there, we both kind of just looked at each other and went, huh? And I kind of felt, I don't know, we felt really weird about it. We were like kind of puzzling over it for a bit, and then you're like, okay, whatever. But then I still kept thinking about it. Like, it still just kind of ruminated in my head. And then probably 2009, 2010 here in Toronto, I wound up at a video store, and a small one of the very small, probably last remaining video stores here in Toronto. And I was talking to the guy working, and he was like, "What are you into?" And I was like, "Horror." And he was like, "Have you seen Martyrs?" And I was like, "No, what's Martyrs?" And so he rented me Martyrs on DVD, and I watched it. And then I was like, oh, and from there, it kind of like, I was like, oh God, it kind of reminds me of that like messed up, violent French film High Tension. And I started to like piece it together. And the next weekend when I went back to return Martyrs, he was like, well, you got to see Inside. So then, and then from there, I was like, oh, this is a whole movement. And from there, I started tracking down all the horror ones and watching them. And, you know, this was really before I felt like super online. So it was a lot of like searching for physical copies and streams and stuff like that as much as possible. And then from there, kind of getting into the art house and finding those, you know, just on a basis of curiosity and of like what was going on in France at the time. And then that, you know, led me to this guy right there, my book. So yeah, eventually some guy's going to tell you to rent something, and then you spend a year of your life, more than a year of your life, writing a book. That's my story.
I mean, I kind of love the fact that you've both come to the films of the new French Extremity from the complete opposite directions. Alex, you with horror, and Lindsay, you with the art house side of new French Extremity. My own obsession with it started, I think I was about 17, and it was my first year in university, and I stumbled upon this weird VHS of Trouble Every Day in my art school library and watch it on a teeny tiny VHS player that was in the library. VHS were gone by this point, but still there was a weird amount of films that were available in the library for some reason, and it drew me in. And I did not know what the hell I was watching, but it struck a chord. And then weirdly, a few years after that, I saw Inside and Martyrs on the big screen at a genre festival in Madrid, almost one after another. And the dots did not connect because the dots were just exterminated, as was my brain and my sensibility. But these films really do stick with you for years. And there is something I think that you only realize in hindsight, that it is quite strange to see this level of horror filmmaking coming from France. And what I wanted to ask you was kind of what is the landscape of French horror look like before these films really started appearing?
Well, I think France doesn't really have a strong tradition of horror cinema, not like we even compared to Britain. I guess there's more the tradition of like the fantastique is more kind of fantasy based. So you had, and also, you know, surrealism, I think, also can connect with horror. I mean, the image of the slitting of the eye in Un Chien Andalou is one of the most, you know, horrific images. But I guess when French filmmakers do venture into the area of horror, it's still, I think, in that kind of fantasy realm, maybe more erotic and romantic, poetic. I think of Jean Rollin is probably one of the most kind of well-known French filmmakers who kept going back to the genre. That's Clouseau. It's more thriller than horror. Yeah, and then it really didn't really seem to be something that gets made very often. I mean, there's a couple of, in the 90s, you start to get a few things, but again, more with the fantasy. I think of Jeanne Caro, like Delicatessen and City of Lost Children. Again, there's more that fantasy aspect to it. But then also you get Man Bites Dog, which I think is part of the season, that it's almost like a precursor. And there's also a film that doesn't get mentioned much, made in 1990 called Baby Blood.
You're right.
And that's all about like pregnancy, although I think it's like, is it an alien parasite or something? But it's kind of like Prevenge, where the baby in the womb is telling the mother to kill. But I think that, I mean, in I was watching a lot of the new French Extremity films again, and yeah, pregnancy is there a lot. So yeah, Baby Blood just seems like something that people don't really mention. But yeah, it's just these kind of singular films. It doesn't really seem like it was really a thriving genre.
Yeah, I mean, that's also what I found. You know, Jean Rollin, you've got Franju's Eyes Without a Face, you've got Clouzot's Les Diaboliques. You know, so those were kind of some of the big like horror moments in French cinema. You know, but then I also link it back a lot to some like horror sensibility in the Grand Guignol theater movement, which was so bloody. But then after World War II, they were like, let's not talk about the things that happened in World War II. And so that got tamped down. And through my research in the book and talking to some people, particularly at TIFF, who got to know a lot of these new French extremity filmmakers, particularly on the horror side. And what I think is important to keep in mind is that just because France didn't have a tradition of horror films doesn't mean they weren't consuming horror films. And I think that's where you see, you know, and I'm sure we'll get into it, all of these tropes that are so popular in like North America, you know, British films, you know, coming into play, and how did the French play with it? And I think one of the things to me about the French film industry is that it's not just entertainment, it's art. It is like this sacred thing that they are so proud of, and to like they should be proud of the amount of stuff that they have done, you know, the innovation, the artistry that has come out of France. But there it's seen as like high art. And I mean, I personally will consider horror high art forever, because it is. But I think there you have the sensibility of like, oh, we don't do horror. We don't. That's an American thing. We don't do it.
It's so kind of interesting. I go back to that screening when I saw Irreversible. I remember it was back when I lived in Australia, and it was part of the French Film Festival. And so in Australia, they had this idea of French cinema, and it often I think was, you know, like set in like idyllic French villages and things like that. And so I think a lot of people came to that Irreversible screening as part of the French Film Festival, possibly not knowing what it was, and just thinking, oh, it's in the French Film Festival. And so I think that it was completely not what people were expecting from a French film whatsoever.
Well, and I think it's important to contextualize, you know, the big international French film that was coming out in the midst of New French Extremity, which was Amélie. You know, the like most disgustingly cute film you can ever make, which has its merits, but like you want to talk about two polar ends of, you know, a spectrum. I think you've got Amélie, you've got like Irreversible and Martyrs, and that's the export. That's what they're known for. They're known for like the city of light and love. These are not, New French Extremity is not the films that the French Tourist Board wants you to see. Like there is the Amélie version of Paris, and then there's the Irreversible version of Paris, and they're two pretty diametrically opposed places.
It's kind of there's something that you mentioned, Alex, that I really wanted to pick up on. It's this idea that the French don't do horror. And I've always, and especially one of the things that really runs through your book that I found really fascinating is that people really fixate on the extremity of New French Extremity, and they forget the Frenchness of it. And that's so important, both for the art house side of New French Extremity, but also especially I think for the horror side, this thing of they consume horror. It's a very American thing. It can be appreciated, but ultimately, like you say, horror is not something they do because it's not considered high art. Similarly to you, it will always be high art in my house, but there is something even quite confrontational in the choice of these young, up and coming, very talented, you know, French filmmakers who are saying, no, we're going to make horror films to make a horror film. This is not an art house film that's borrowing the language of horror. It is full on a horror film in the tradition of the sort of stuff that we love that is mostly American. So I wanted to ask kind of, what do you think is the turning point where New French Extremity started essentially being full on horror that was not ashamed of being horror? I'm not necessarily saying that the previous films, Irreversible and so on, were ashamed of that, but they were being talked about like art house films that were very intense, not like horror films.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, and for me, the turning point comes when a lot of these auteurs, like your Gaspar Noés, your Claire Denis, people who are really, you know, confrontational, kind of like these enfants terribles in the French cinema community, they're starting to be talked about in terms of horror. Claire Denis made a horror film. Gaspar Noé made a horror film. And I kind of felt like they started to back off a bit at that point. They weren't, it's not that they weren't making or continue to make confrontational, challenging films, but they, I think, felt like that art house movement of filmmakers started to go, okay, we're going to back up. And I think for them, they were borrowing, maybe perhaps subconsciously or intentionally. I think you can make that argument, you know, which way you want. They were art house filmmakers borrowing from horror to get their points across. Then I think you see the horror filmmakers, these guys who are like, we know these films, we want to make them and lean into it, really unabashedly make horror films, as you were saying. And what they did that is so unique and so special is they borrowed from art house to make really singular horror films. And that's what's so exciting. They feel so spiritual and philosophical and deep, but also like really violent and really technical. So they have that kind of confrontational aspect that the others do. So they do, you know, I don't know if you'd ever get, you know, the art house group of filmmakers and the horror filmmakers together at the same cocktail party, but like the concentration at this time is so important. And I remember when I was researching my book and I was researching stuff about Inside, and I forget which of the directors it was, but they were doing an interview with Rue Morgue, and one of them said, you know, and I quote it in the book, but you know, we made this film because we're pissed at Sarkozy and we hate who he is and we hate what he's doing to our country, and this is our answer to him. So they're being political, just in, you know, a different way that, you know, I think North American audiences and, you know, maybe other Western or, you know, a larger international audiences are so ready to accept and engage in. But it's more complicated for, you know, a French audience to find it. So that's why my understanding, my research was like, they weren't that big in their home country. They were big outside of it.
I think a turning point for me, I think, is Trouble Every Day, in that, yeah, it is an art house director, but she would talk about how she wanted to make like a Cronenberg body horror. So she did have that intent there. And I think Trouble Every Day is possibly the first of the films where there's all the stories about people fainting. I feel like would that have been like the first film where there was this Cannes screenings with people fainting and passing, you know, leaving and vomiting or whatever. And yeah, I think Trouble Every Day is the turning point. But for me, the first out and out horror possibly would be High Tension. I think that was where it was like balls to the wall, like we're making a horror film. And yeah, and very directly referencing slasher tropes, where I guess, you know, if you're making a kind of, a Cronenberg has some kind of credibility, I guess, more than trying to make, you know, like a slasher film. But it's interesting because when I first started getting into learning about these films, I always thought of the horror films as separate. Like I thought the new French Extremity was the Catherine Breillat, Gaspar Noé, you know, Trouble Every Day, and then the Martyrs, High Tension seemed separate to me. Maybe maybe because they come a bit later. Yeah, it always seemed like they were separate. I didn't realize it was only more along, I guess. They're kind of all kind of connected. Maybe you could kind of, it was this particular moment. But it was, as I was watching some of these films recently, I came across a film I'd never seen before from 1998 called Sombre. And yeah, Philip Grandeur, and I'm sure in a million years Philip Grandeur would never say it was like a horror film, but it's about a serial killer, rapist, murderer. But it's all very experiential and kind of more experimental. But then I remember his interviews with him where he's saying he was like a dark fairy tale and all about the unconscious, and he's working with archetypes. And I'm like, that's what a lot of horror is always been doing. So I think, yeah, a lot of because there's always this fixation which kind of irritates me about horror being just about scaring you. Like if people say, oh, was it scary? And I'm like, well, horror does so much more than that. And all the other stuff that horror does is what I think was influencing a lot of the art house filmmakers. Yeah, the privileging of image and affect before narrative, and yeah, the use of shock and the breaking of taboos. that, you know, that, and those conversations and debates and controversy is usually, previously, I guess, was more to do with horror cinema, and this was kind of the first, I guess, kind of art house genre where they were, entering into those debates, and certainly about the ethics and morality, because you always get people like, why do you watch these films? How can you like these films? And yeah, it's kind of people asking questions about, well, of these films as well.
There is something really interesting that you point out there, Lindsay, about kind of what is the purpose of horror films, right? And people kind of generally, I guess, non-horror fans assume that it's, oh, horror films just want to scare you. But this particular group of horror films just feels very uninterested in scaring people. Like, it feels like they're trying to aim for something a little bit different. And I mean, I've used your book extensively when researching for the season, Alex, but there's one quote that really stood out to me, that, you know, these are not necessarily just violent films, they're films about violence. And I wanted to ask you both, what do you think the horror films of the new French Extremity are concerned about? Like, what do they actually want to explore? You know, is it always a political response? They don't seem necessarily too concerned about sex or policing sexuality in the way that, say, American slasher films were. What do you think they're interested in exploring through the medium of horror?
I think, to speak really generally, and through a lot of different avenues, these films are about the individual and the individual identity within systems, and what happens when those systems are corrupted, what happens when you as an individual push back against them. And I think it's about this tension of like power, and power can manifest itself in so many ways. Like, there's a lot of stuff about gender in these films, there's a lot of stuff about immigration in these films. It's like there's some really like hot topic issues, and it might not be overtly mentioned. Like, I think rarely is it ever overtly mentioned in these films, but we're just experiencing them. Like, I think Sample is such a great example of those films that are so, esoteric, and they're all about like this kind of hypnotic way of feeling things and feeling uncomfortable in that. But especially, as a North American audience member, I feel like we're so conditioned to expect resolution and outcomes and things to be, the Hays Code is dead, but we still expect resolution at the end of the films. And when we've got these films that are about power and systems of power, and there's no resolution or a very unclear one, there's a lot of anxiety put on us as individual audience members to say, well, what did that mean? How do I feel about it now? Who was the villain in this film? And sometimes they're very hard questions to answer. And a lot of times people disagree because there's so many ways to interpret these films. It's a really interesting conversation, and one that I'm always, happy to read and think and hear more about.
I think, well, for a lot of the filmmakers, a lot of what they're doing comes from a place of anger. They're angry. And I think Xavier Gens, when he said Frontiers, and it's very overt in the film. The opening credits are the footage of riots, and it's saying about how there's a right-wing candidate has got to the second round. And he kind of has said in interviews that, in 2002, where the right-wing candidate got into the second round, that was one of the worst days for him. And so much of it comes from there. And I think there is definitely, I think, the political aspect of these films. I think a lot of what they're talking about is about the rise of the right and neo-fascism and the xenophobia, the racism, the inequality that is kind of rife. I mean, we just had there was just an election just recently, and it's now we've got the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen is now there, which is interesting in that so many of these films are about crazy twisted families, and I guess they have one that that is always being referenced. So I think that again, it's all about that emotion, and I think a lot of it is anger and probably despair. There is that bleakness and that lack of resolution, because in many ways things aren't getting better.
And it feels very pertinent to point out as well that kind of at the same time as these films were coming out of France, it wasn't necessarily it was also a very bleak moment for a lot of other countries in Europe as well. So I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about how this wave of French horror films fit into a broader wave of European horror filmmaking.
Well, I think there was across Europe, you have these auteurs that are also, I mean, I think the first ones that come to mind are like Lars von Trier, Michael Haneke, who, it's interesting that Michael Haneke made these films, like I think The Piano Teacher never gets talked about as part of the new French Extremity. But a lot of what's in The Piano Teacher seems similar. But you know, I think also across Europe you get co-productions and things like that. So there is definitely, I think, a lot of interaction across Europe and with different filmmakers, like Haneke, who's Austrian and makes films in France and all sorts of. And also you have just an extreme cinema trend, I guess, in Asia as well, was happening around the same time. So, but I think within Europe, I think there's still working through stuff from World War II. I think that's still there, the legacy of colonialism. And yeah, just historical events and atrocities. And then of course you've got, and it was, you know, post 9/11, but the war on terror, there are terrorist attacks across Europe, in, you know, Madrid and in Paris. So, and again, the rise of the right is happening across Europe. So I think there are all these, there are similar issues that filmmakers are using extreme cinema and horror cinema to kind of work through.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, or a good amount of scholarship about this kind of extremity. You know, there's one, you know, you can look at it like European extremity, there's Asian extremity, there's torture porn in America. You know, there's, you know, probably even others I'm not as familiar with. And I think they all are kind of dealing with a lot of these similar issues. There was so much anxiety at the turn of the millennium about our place in the world, people's, you know, place in the world as individuals, as societies, as communities. And I think France kind of had that perfect storm of this history of trauma. Like, I have a chapter in my book about the history, like a very brief like overview of the history of France, and those people do not take a rest. They're like, oh, do we not have a war or revolution going on? Sacre bleu, like, and then let's go invade somewhere, like that's what they do. And I think France kind of has this perfect storm of like, they're seen as this cultural bastion of like intellectualism and beauty and art, and they have this huge method of exporting their culture, which is film, to perpetuate that narrative that they want to export to the rest of the world. And then if you're going to be really like punk rock about things, what do? You upset that mode of distribution. And I think you saw a lot of these filmmakers who are, you know, in art school, you know, again, as I was talking about earlier, that notion of film as high art in France, and then it being a way to disrupt a kind of cultural selling mode. So it felt like there's something, and I think every filmmaker who is part of this or is going to be part of any kind of similar movement has this attitude. I think the difference is France had this storm of just like, it was getting so bad, so quickly, and it still is, and it hasn't gotten a lot better, that they just went, you know, married and started making stuff that pissed people off. This is how I don't swear on a BFI at home.
I have so much respect for that.
Thank you. I'm very impressed with myself.
I'm very impressed with you right now. But there's something that I was thinking as you were talking about this kind of the sense of pride that the French have in their own culture and their cinema. You know, the exported vision of France, which is the Amélie version. It's the reason, you know, not to be basic, but let's be basic. It's the reason I got really obsessed with living in Paris in a moment of my life. And Paris has nothing to do with the Paris of Amélie. And you discover that very quickly on the first day. But there is the idea of Paris that they sell to the outside world, and there's also a sense of, you know, they're the inventors of the cinematic language. So there is a sense of pride in even in the output of French cinema of, well, we don't borrow from other people because we made this stuff up, we created it. So, you know, we'll create new techniques and new versions and new forms of expressing ourselves through the art of cinema. But one thing that again feels quite intensely controversial in that sense about these horror films is that they very much borrow very explicitly and deliberately from American horror cinema, which is, you know, in the context of considering horror cinema to be trash art and also considering to be everything that's not French cinema trashier art, is kind of like borrowing from the lowest of the low and then making it in French and calling it high art as well. So I was wondering kind of if you could comment on, where do you see and how do you think these horror films borrowed from American genre films, or I guess, you know, North American genre filmmaking, and how they implemented that in made it French?
I think just recently I was writing something on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then coming and watching these films again, I'm like, yeah, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the godfather of the new French Extremity horror films. So many of them just seem to be riffing, and a lot of interviews that I read, they all cite the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as one of the key influence. And you get a lot of these films where they're showing, yeah, the rural backwoods of France, again, very, very differently to how it's been shown before. And yeah, I guess it's almost like anti-heritage films that, you know, subverting ideas about, you know, the elegant, charming countryside, the provincial life with sipping wine and whatever. Yeah, it's completely, and it's very much, you know, going back to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they had that kind of grittier aesthetic. So you had in the 80s the cinema de look, which was criticized for taking a lot from America, but it was very nice. It's still very, it was called the cinema de look. It was all about this superficial surface of things looking really good. And it seemed like the kind of gritty realist aesthetic of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is what they're almost like taking the ugliness from some of these American films rather than the nice sheen that you get with the cinema de look style films. And so, yeah, I think there, you know, I think there is definitely a crossover with the torture porn trend as well, which was also very kind of a very ugly, and yeah, I guess unlikable characters. You know, there's very much part of torture porn, and I guess in America, I guess it was they realized after 9/11 that no one liked them. And so I think, yeah, you're kind of getting a bit of that in France as well, that's kind of coming to terms with, you know, I guess going against that myth of universalism of, you know, liberty, equality, and fraternity. That's not what France is like. And even in the horror film set in urban areas, it's more the peripheral suburbs, the banlieue, rather than the central kind of Paris that you see in these films. So yeah, it's I guess certainly taking American things, but yeah, obviously making it very, very French. But it just seemed like, yeah, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre seemed to be there in all of them in some way.
Yeah, I definitely felt that same kind of like American 70s spirit present within this movement. And I think, you know, if you look at, you know, American film in the 70s, that's when those young filmmakers rebelled against the establishment and the studio systems. So I think here it's also a kind of that similar ethos is in the air. And I don't know if this is kind of maybe a controversial opinion, but I really see I Stand Alone as the French version of Taxi Driver, you know, which has that, you know, kind of man on his own, just raging against everything. And I think what they do with these tropes, and, you know, I think sometimes it's really overt. Sometimes I think it's, you know, it's part of a film fan language. If you are a fan and a student of cinema, you know these films. So sometimes inherently you just pull from them. but, I think it's, taking the elements that we find, or we, maybe initially found with these films to be like upsetting and shocking, and then pushing them to a whole other degree. Like you thought Taxi Driver was upsetting. What about a little incest on the side? You thought Texas Chainsaw was upsetting. See what Xavier Jean gets up to in Frontiers. Like there is this, if the 70s, American films were some of the most extreme that were ever made, this is pushing it in a way, and it's so serious. Like maybe outside of Chetin, there's not a lot of winking at the camera. It is so bleak, and it is so desolate in a will to live that it just pushes it to this extreme where I think the French filmmakers are like, well, if we're going to do this, we've got to push it to the max. And if we're going to be noticed and not dismissed, then we have to push it to the max.
It's also quite rooted in reality. It's very rarely supernatural, isn't it? Aside from also Shaitan, I guess, which is the only perhaps outlier where it's kind of funny, kind of almost zany, although also a little sprinkling of incest for good measure, because that's what they love a little bit of incest.
I mean, why not? Why not? Just
Vincent Cassel in drag, playing his own sister.
But
the ball in that film.
One of the things that I find, and I'm not going to name the films maybe for fear of spoiling them for anyone who's not watched them yet, but I wonder if you think this is important as well, that some very prominent kind of films, of the horror films of the new French Extremity, gender flip their villains, and the villains are female, which is also not necessarily what we usually are led to expect from our horror films. And I wonder if you think that this presence of quite also extremely violent female villains is significant. Do you think that's an important aspect of these horror films?
I mean, I don't find like female killers to be like that big outliers, particularly in the slasher genre. They spoil it in Scream, so I'm just going to say it. Mrs. Voorhees is the killer in Friday the 13th. And then, you got Brenda in Urban Legend, you've got Jill in Scream 4, like and then so many others. So I don't think the killer reveal or the antagonist revealed to be a woman is that shocking or that different. What I do think is different is that a lot of the American films that utilize that, it's just kind of to like put a twist at the end. It's that scorpion sting at the end of the film, and it's this kind of final reveal, because the whole time you've been like, who is the killer? And it maybe doesn't have that much impact on the rest of the film. Whereas I think in a lot of new French Extremity, when you whether either the antagonist is revealed or their motivations are explained, then it kind of messes with our whole understanding of the film and the world we've been inhabiting. And it's like, whoa, oh, this is why it's happening. Okay, I need to rethink everything I have experienced. And it seems like maybe a subtle distinction, but I think once you've kind of watched a few of these and you kind of get that, oh wait, everything I just thought for the last, 80, 90 minutes was, not true. It's a very different way of watching the film, as, arguing with your friend if you guess the killer right.
I think horror is very much, I've always said it's an inherently feminine genre. It has more female heroes, but as Alex said, the hero villains. I also think in giallo films, there's very much, it's always playing with gender, but there's lots of female killers in giallo films that are kind of revealed towards the end. And so I think, it's just about different aspects of the female experience. I think, that also you get a lot of women filmmakers working. It's one of the, possibly not really a surprising thing that there's a lot of women in this movement making films. And so, yeah, and I was one thing, again, I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but a couple of films where the women are the killers, it seemed like they were often driven by love. Like, I think about, I mean, inside, it's kind of within the first 10 minutes or so. Is that spoiler territory to talk about the woman in Inside?
Not a spoiler to talk about her, but definitely don't talk about
No,
she's killing.
because it's just interesting that in Inside, I find that the lead character of Sarah, she almost seems kind of ambivalent about her pregnancy and her child, obviously, because she's just lost her husband, so she's grieving. It almost seems like the woman almost loves the baby more than Sarah does, or she's driven by some perverted need to have this child and to love this child. And so it's just different aspects of the female character and experience. We can be heroes and we can be villains.
There's something that I think you both mentioned in different points of this conversation, that there's something that about these horror films that really strikes a sort of almost existential nerve, that they kind of stick with you in a way that, you know, beyond the scares, beyond the gore or the graphic violence, there's a nugget of something that's is perhaps quite difficult to address or even articulate within you. And I wanted to use that to come to Martyrs, which we've kind of mentioned as we were talking about these films, but it feels like Martyrs is the end of the new French Extremity. And what an end. But I wonder if you think if it did end essentially this period of horror filmmaking, and as one of the perhaps most overtly, most verbally, most explicitly existential of films from this moment in cinema, what do you think about Martyrs kind of really struck a chord with people, with audiences? And I mean, aside from the extremely graphic violence and the extreme torture, I don't necessarily think, perhaps this is controversial, that it's the violence that strikes a chord with people around Martyrs. There's plenty of very hyper violent horror films of varying degrees of success, but when people talk about Martyrs, myself included, it's the sort of film you want to watch once in your life and then you still remember it shot by shot and the questions that it poses to you. So that's a kind of a two-part question. Do you think Martyrs ended New French Extremity, and what do you think about it really strikes a chord with audiences when they see it even now?
I think with Martyrs, it's because you are so completely with the victim. So it's not about torture. I think the director Logier has said it's about pain. So it's not really focusing on, because in some of the other films, it's the whole thing of getting into the mind and experience of like someone who is sadistic and inflicting this pain on people. And this, it's just completely, you are just in with the victim, and it's just unrelenting. I think that a lot of it is like feels very real time. Things are really drawn out. I mean, there's sequences of torture that just seem to go on and on. It becomes repetitive, almost numbing in a sense, but it feels like it's never ending. And one thing that also came to mind is I remember there was an interview with Georges Franju for Fantastique magazine, and he was talking about, I think he was asked like, what was the scariest film you've ever seen? And he said that it was something called, it was a medical film called Treponation for Epileptic Seizures or something like that. And he was saying he saw it like in a theater, and that people were passing out, and it's this whole thing because it's a medical procedure. And he was saying that for him, it seemed like, because obviously the person would have been like under an anesthetic or something, that you're seeing this awful thing, but the person it's happening to is not reacting to it. And so that almost somehow heightened the emotion and the response in the audience. And then, of course, in Eyes Without a Face, you've got the sequence of the taking the face off. And again, the person it's happening to is not reacting to it. And I think as Martyrs goes on, there's less of reaction from the victim. And I guess it was because they're reaching this state of transcendence. But it is almost like this, there is a coldness or clinical aspect to the film as well, especially like in the house that it's all in is very cold and clinically, and the violence and the torture that's being meted out is not, they're not getting any kind of kick out of it. It's methodical, it's for a particular purpose, it's not for any kind of pleasure or anything like that. I think that's another thing about the film, is I find that there's so much sexual violence in a lot of New French Extremity, and that element seemed missing in Martyrs as well. But I don't know, for me, it just seemed like maybe there's something about the clinical aspect to it that there is almost, this kind of medical gaze, which actually it can be really unsettling.
Yeah, I think there's probably, I would put part of that into my answer as well. And it kind of feels like Martyrs is like the most extreme you can get. And then everyone just kind of went, all right, we're out. But I also think, like, when we think about spirituality and religion, it's one of the last few like bastions so many of us have. Like, I mean, I was not raised in the church. I'm not religious at all. But, there's this belief, this persistent belief that something is watching over us, that something is protecting us, like magical thinking to the extreme. And Martyrs, it has extreme violence, and then it has this extreme nihilism, to a certain kind of nihilism that, listen, you might not get where you're wanting to go to, and the places you have to go to get there, you don't want to know about. And so I think it's this very challenging moment within the horror community, because so often a lot of films still feel very right-wing in that, just call the priest will solve it. And this reliance on Christianity that is so omnipresent. But here it's like, what, maybe there is a religion, maybe there is a God, but it's not going to be the way you think it is. And I think that is very shocking. And, even a few years prior to that, if you look at like Passion of the Christ, there was also this huge, like, we think about, Jesus and this moment in, our kind of cultural history, but then we're not prepared, or we didn't want to be prepared at the time, to actually have to see what a person would have to go through in that instance. When we actually have to see what has to happen to someone for them to become a martyr, it's like, ooh, be careful what you wish for.
And it seems so much about like what has been done in religion, the violence and atrocities that have been inflicted in the name of religion, and often the fact that it's this, I guess they're a Christian group, but they're also the very bourgeois upper class, and it's always been that idea of, well, you're going to suffer in this life, but you'll be rewarded in the next. So kind of just keep your place, and maybe we'll benefit from what we can learn from you, from your suffering, without having to go through it. So I think there's definitely also that critique there as well.
And I'm starting to think about wrapping up this conversation, as fascinating as it's been. I wanted to ask kind of, we started this off by talking about how there wasn't really a tradition of horror filmmaking aside from a few outliers in French cinema. And although it was being consumed, it was being watched and clearly influencing young filmmakers. But what was the reception of these films like? And did they got really big internationally? And I was wondering kind of if you could put that a little bit into context, like what was the reaction in France versus the reaction outside of France?
Well, I mean, I think within France, they still didn't get that kind of cultural moment that they were hoping for. And I always feel like we have to caveat a little bit in horror, like, these are really big movies in the horror community. You ask most people on the street, they'll have no idea what Martyrs is. And so I think, this kind of legacy is for, people who are driven by horror and driven by cinema. We like, this is, if we're going to segment the audience, this is for us film nerds. This isn't for, and film nerds who are willing to take a risk. And that's not everyone. And I think for so often, a lot of these films were like spread around through film festivals, through DVDs, through VHSs. There is a really, sense that this was kind of a guy at the video store is going to have to tell you to go rent Martyrs, because I probably would not have picked up Martyrs on my own. There's a word of mouth quality to this that I think is really important.
And I think a lot of these films, a lot of it was benefiting from the festival system, which would be interesting if it would happen now in the age of streaming. But yeah, it's a lot of these films, they did get that word of mouth from festival screenings. A lot of them were shown at Cannes, but then also shown at genre film festivals. But I think it's interesting, like someone who goes to genre festivals, there is more now, like there seems to be this crossover with kind of, is it art house or is it a horror film? Like I go to Fright Fest every year, and it's like the discovery screens are there. It seems to be this, there is definitely this kind of aspect to genre that's kind of, so I think that maybe that's a legacy of the new French Extremity, that genre and art house kind of, it was made clear that there's a lot of crossover. And so and I think it was the word of mouth for these films seemed to mostly come from film festival screenings, especially if someone fainted or had to call an ambulance or something, which in some ways I think maybe that some people sometimes maybe viewed them as quite cynical, that they were just using shock because, like, how do you stand out in the marketplace? Well, if someone fainted at one of your screenings, then people are going to be interested. So I think sometimes I think the initial article written by James Quant, where he coined the term new French Extremity, I think he was, because he was saying, like, why are filmmakers like Bruno Dumont resorting to these tactics? So I guess
I think there's something really interesting that you mentioned about kind of the role of festivals. I think Cannes is really important. I think TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, is extremely important, particularly for the horror ones. And there is something that kind of this idea, that a scholar kind of posited this idea of tacky spectatorship, which I'm really fascinated by, which is, it fits within the space of a prestigious film festival, then it's okay to watch these really intense horror films. But also how these, the shock value of them, the reactions, the walkouts, the puking, the fainting, all of this is, we're still kind of seeing it now, but it does increase this idea of, oh, well, now I want to see what the fuss is all about. I want to see whether I can brave it, or I can put myself through it as well, which I think is a big thing amongst horror fans. It's, is, can I stand this one? Can I deal with this horror film that these people say is too much, even for horror fans? This like sense of competition that exists within the community, which is great. And also, well, it is what it is. But I did want to kind of ask you as well about, aside from perhaps the marketing of the faintings and the reactions, which I think has always been a part of horror film exhibition ever since, the 1930s. There's always been gimmicks, and there was people who would leave, exhibitors would sort of put ambulances outside of particular screenings, and they'd do competitions to see if women in particular could sit through the horrors of Frankenstein. Or I was wondering, where do you see the contemporary influence of these films? Where do you see the influence of the horrors of the new French Extremity in horror filmmaking now? Lindsay, you mentioned kind of this interplay between art house and horror, but is there anything else where you can feel it?
I think there's the whole thing about elevated horror would stem from this. But recently, when I was getting over COVID, I decided I was going to have a day where I just watched all the Scream films. And it was interesting.
Great decision.
Yeah, it was a good way to kind of try and forget the COVID. But it was interesting to watch them, because you got the 2004 one where they kept referencing the torture porn stuff, and how now we, how do we make a Scream film in this moment? And then the most recent one, the whole references was, elevated horror. It's going to be a meditation on grief. It's not just a horror film, it's these other things. And so I think, again, we keep talking about like it's the mixture of the genre and art house. I think that's still definitely a kind of an influence. Horror has always been political, but I think, what the New French Extremity, which was talking about the rise of the right and neo-fascism and racism and xenophobia, inequalities, that's definitely also very much prevalent in horror films today. So I think there's influence there. I also think maybe there's television has become so much more extreme. I remember when you first saw the fire extinguisher scene in Irreversible, I remember at the time I was just never seen. And now you get in television, you get really, really extreme stuff. So it's like within 20 years, it's now on television. So I think it's even the influence is there, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think you can look at these as a precursor to elevated horror. These are films that really prove that you can marry big ideas with gore and horror. And if you go back to like the art house stuff with like 29 Palms, like, what is that if not it's the scariest movie I've ever seen. And that we can have that, there isn't the biggest audience for it. It's never going to be wide releases in theaters, but what have any of the elevated horror ones really been? Like the closest you're going to get is an A24 film, and those do well, but they do well by indie standards. So I think they've kind of given filmmakers and studios and distributors a bit of a model that if we can actually get in on these filmmakers early enough and nurture them, then we can see how far their careers will go. And if you look at, like Martyrs and Inside, were both distributed in North America by Dimension Extreme. And that is such a weird banner to have. And I think we all kind of know what the Weinsteins are about now. And so it's not exactly the most conducive place for a young filmmaker to grow and understand the industry. It's basically, we are taking your product and we are making money off of it. It's not, let's foster and develop a career with you. So I think it's, proven that, that there is an audience for it, and the discourse around these films is so strong that people get really excited about it and want to have that same kind of like, ooh, they said something edgy and complicated. How can we do more of that?
And I think also, like I mentioned before, how the New French Extremity, there were so many women filmmakers. And I think now, the future of horror is female. That, we have it. I mean, everyone talks about Julia Duca now is kind of, I guess, carrying the torch. Also, there was an amazing film, Revenge, as well. So I think more I guess, women filmmakers, I think, can take inspiration from the New French Extremity, that women were really driving that moment. And that the kind of, the extremes that they were going to, the boundaries that they were pushing, and what they really were kind of saying about the female experience, that, it waltzed it all, like just every aspect of it. It was kind of not shying away from anything. And I think women filmmakers can take a lot of inspiration from that moment.
I think the blend between art house and horror film has definitely been, that line has been blurred beyond any sense of recognition, which I, for one, I'm kind of grateful for, because that's the gray area where I like to live. But it is, Julie Ducournau is the most obvious example, I think, mainly because she's very much a Cannes Film Festival darling, in the same way as a lot of these films, the New French Extremity films, were Cannes Film Festival darlings. So that seems to, essentially, it feels like history is repeating itself, only, barely 20 years after these films were made, and some of them, that we're seeing the same kind of conversation or reaction. But now I feel like it's been as much as the conversation about it's the most extreme or weird film at Cannes this year or last year or whatever year, it's now being taken with the seriousness, with the same kind of level of seriousness that the films are made with, and kind of having that big moment in the sun, both critically and audience wise. But we need to wrap up at this point, which is a shame because I could go on forever with talking to both of you. But I wanted to ask, kind of, for anyone who has perhaps stumbled across this video on the BFI YouTube channel and has never seen a horror film from the new French Extremity, in which case, who are you? I admire your choices. Well done for sticking around. But if they're curious, which horror film of the new French Extremity would you recommend someone start their journey into the depths of this movement with?
I love the idea of this YouTube video being like a cursed ring-like video that people are like, what is this? Sticking around.
I'm manifesting it now. I'm hoping that there's someone who has never heard of New French Extremity, has never heard of Martyrs, has never seen it,
and they're still here.
Stuck around.
They're still here listening to us. You know what? I'm going to be a little bit of an outlier. We have not talked about this film in this conversation, but I think one that blends a lot of the things I really love about this movement of film is Calvaire, or The Ordeal.
Oh yes,
such an interesting, weird film that still is just exciting to think about and really stimulating to watch, and great performance.
Great. Also, one of the I would argue one of the most profoundly creepy dance sequences of the entirety of cinema.
I mean, it's got everything. What else do you want from movies?
As long as a horror film has a dance sequence, that's all I really want from a horror film.
Got Calvaire and Suspiria. I mean,
so Alex, you've become the guy at the video store now, you realize.
It finally happened. It finally happened. I am a horror bro. It's good. It's good. I like it.
Yeah. I think probably High Tension would be a good place to start, because if you can go with that, if you can handle the first violent scenes, if you can make it through that, and then you can have, there's twists and turns, and see how you feel about that, and then I guess from that also, I think it's quite short, isn't it? So it's under 90 minutes. That's always a good entry point, I think, as a short film. You don't want them to I would say High Tension.
Both great recommendations, very different from one another. I'm gonna go with Inside, mainly perhaps because it is incredibly violent in a way that is, I would argue, impacted me more than perhaps even Martyrs, and to Beatrice Dahl. I think more people should know her, more people should fear her, more people should appreciate her. I think this is one of her most absolutely unhinged in the roles, in the most control kind of way. And she is in her own right a sort of the female face of the new French Extremity, having appeared in Trouble Every Day and in Inside. So yeah.
And the cover of my book.
The cover.
She's truly the face.
The dog-eared copy of which I have here by my desk.
Do you know, I've had so many friends lovely friends who've read this book, and they're like, I took me longer to finish it because I can't read it in public because of the stares I get because of that.
I've actually relished that. I've taken it on the tube here with me in London. I was like, yeah, what of it? Look at all the post-its. But thank you both so much. We need to wrap up here, but I just want to say how much I appreciate both of you giving up a little bit of your time and a lot of your insight for this conversation, and for sharing the love for these incredible and incredibly brutal films. So thank you so much, Alex, and thank you so much, Lindsay.
Merci.
And for anyone watching, thank you so much for tuning in. If you had never heard of the films of the new French Extremity, once again, you're here to stay now. And I hope you enjoy or endure the horrors of the new French Extremity.